Welcome everyone. We have a really big group, as you can tell from the number of hellos. This is our WSDG educational webinar series that is new for 2020. And we are kicking it off with John Storyk, the founding partner, with Lessons from Electric Lady and Beyond. As many of you know, you've been on enough Zoom webinars at this point. We'll use the Q&A feature for questions. With this many people in attendance, it's going to be really tough to get through all of them. We have some interesting, fun, interactive polls during the session, and we even might have a special guest. So I'm going to kick it off and hand it over to the founding partner of WSDG, Mr. John Storyk.
Hey, Justin.
Hey, John.
How are you?
I'm well.
Well, this is exciting. I have been on a lot of Zooms, but I haven't been the center of attention on a Zoom. Thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Sergio Mojo and some of the other members of our WSDG team. This is an idea that's taken a month or so to develop. A number of us in WSDG do a lot of teaching, but as most of you know, we're studio designers and technologists. We're still working. It's a strange moment in history. We're lucky enough to continue to work, but we felt that maybe we had some information to share with everybody. It's pretty exciting to see all the Q&A and people saying hello. I'm not going to be able to look at the Q&A. Justin is doing that, so I apologize if I'm not able to say hello to people that I might know. Maybe Justin will help. Anyway, let's get started. This is a kind of a talk that I've given a few times in the past, and always searching to improve it, and always searching to build on the title of the talk. Let me go share my screen. I think this should work relatively seamlessly. Let's try it. I think it's gonna work. Looks like it. It's gonna work. Yeah, there we go. Okay. We can have some music. Okay, great. That seems to be doing the job. So, studio architecture and acoustics, and of course technology is my world and the world of our team. We have about 60 or 70 people in a global organization, as many of you know. We now call ourselves WSDG, trying to get a little bit bigger than Walters and Storyk. Walters is my wife. That's Beth Walters, my partner in everything for 32 years. I'm currently in Durham, North Carolina. The C-19 moment has sort of pushed us around into some strange environments, but we're all in the same room right now, that's for sure. For a long time, I tried to think about what a good title would be to sort of talk about my favorite subject, which is studio design, past, present, and future. And I figured it didn't take long to come up with this name. And since this is where things started for me, Jimmy changed our lives, obviously, musically, but he certainly changed my life architecturally, probably without even knowing it. This is what we spend most of our time doing, basically combining these three disciplines. I like to think of ourselves as the sort of being at the nexus of architecture, acoustics, and technology. We couldn't pick a better universe for this to happen, which is the recording studio world and the recording studio design disciplines. So acoustics has been with us for a long time. Proof of the pudding would be this drawing, this photo. I actually have been in this amphitheater with extraordinary acoustics, although I see nothing in the literature to prove that anybody really knew what they were doing. We now know why it works, but I'm not sure if anybody really knew then why it works. And even Louis Sullivan's famous Auditorium from the late 1800s, still not convinced that Louis Sullivan really understood acoustics. And so our world is a relatively new world, historically speaking. And if you think about it, none of this makes sense until we have something to record with. So now we're starting to see dates that are a little bit more current. Can't really have a recording studio if you don't have any recording technology. So let's fast forward a little bit to an era that possibly some of us today in the room were alive. I was alive in 1950. I wasn't very old, but at least I was alive. So here's a typical recording studio from the 50s. Not particularly interesting, although I'd like to have some of the gear there, at least some of the vintage gear, or at least have the vintage faceplate. And you'll notice a few things here. First of all, the room's really small. It's not particularly interesting to be in. It probably didn't sound that good. It probably didn't need to sound much better than the medium that the technology was supporting. And of course, that wall between the engineering side of the glass and the content side of the glass, the musician side of the glass, was quite real, both in the business sense and in the architectural sense. Okay, how does this all change in a relatively short amount of time? Okay, I've always contended that it was the artists that have done it. I think the manufacturers and the technologists might take a slightly different position, but since I'm controlling the newsletter for the next hour or so, I'm going to stick with the artist version. Okay, I like that one better. I'm a musician growing up. In fact, I thought I was going to be a professional musician. That didn't work out, but another career did. Everybody I think can pretty much recognize what's happening in this picture and who these people are. So how do we get from that first slide to hundreds and hundreds of studios that might look like this, which are architecturally extraordinary? The equipment is amazing. They have ergonomic features and architectural features that are interesting, great lighting, daylight when required. They could have trees, plants, fish tanks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did we get there? How did we get there relatively quickly? I think that this happens, and I'm being quite simplistic about it, in what I'm sort of loosely calling a golden era of recording studios, which in some ways sort of starts in the mid-60s and kind of goes to the mid-80s until basically everybody has a recording studio by 1990. Well, not everybody, but close to everybody. Okay, and so how did this happen? My position is that artists take over and force the studios, okay, to accommodate them. And this was happening in a number of places. On the West Coast, Beach Boys, Graham Nash in San Francisco, small homes in Nashville were becoming studios, rock stars, and other people in England were putting studios in castles, et cetera, et cetera. And they were living in parallel with what I would call the mothership recording studios, which were basically organized and contained by the record labels, Capitol, A&M in the late 70s, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sorry, in 1969. So let's talk about this. So one such example is Electric Lady Studios. Why do I want to discuss this? Because this is where my story begins. So I don't have to read about it because I was lucky enough to be there. So the first lesson from Electric Lady Studios for me is make your first project famous. I, of course, did not know this was happening. I was 22 years old, so it would be kind of hard to even have any idea about what was happening in life. I just sort of woke up one day and all of a sudden this project appeared. It wasn't quite that simple. In fact, it calls to mind my favorite word, absolutely my drop dead favorite word, which is serendipity. And so it's a little history of Electric Lady and a little sort of underlying of this, my favorite word, serendipity. This is the original studio building. It was built in the 1920s. Let me move over this. I think I'm going to move this guy over a little bit. Maybe I'll put him down here. Okay. And it's just an extraordinary building. This is what it looked like. And actually, to a certain extent, some of it still looks like this. Some of the windows on the top. It's a 3-story building with a basement. And it was the first movie theater. Let me just get back onto, okay. It was designed by Frederick Kiesler, an architect that probably nobody, very few people in the room here today know about him. But he was one of my favorite architects in architecture school, where I was studying in the mid-60s, right down the road at Princeton. And Frederick Kiesler really only did 2 buildings. and then he kind of taught and sculpted and did some theoretical buildings. He wasn't particularly prolific. He was a little hard to get along with. But as a young man, he came over from Vienna and got this commission to do this amazing movie theater on the ground floor, which up until the 90s still existed. It was an extraordinary movie theater. And as you can see, it was the first film theater in the United States to not have a stage, because most film theaters were vaudeville theaters. Below it was a club. For years, it was a polka club. And in the 60s, it became a blues club called The Generation. I knew about this club because I used to go to that club because I was in a blues band. So already this building and this theater is sort of entering my life, although I had no idea I was in Frederick Kiesler's building, and I actually never even went into the theater because I'm not really from Manhattan. It wasn't until later on that I discovered that I had been frequenting the very building designed by the architect who I was a huge fan of, okay? Upon arriving to New York in the late 60s, a fluke set of events that we won't get into sort of got me a commission. This is, by the way, Frederick Kiesler's really only other building that he designed, which was a building that I did know about. He was an old man at the time. You can see a picture of him. And this is the Dead Sea Scrolls Museum in Israel, which was a building that I did know and did finally get to see, okay? In the late 60s, I got a commission to do a kind of a club in Soho that was a little bit ahead of its time, sort of an experiential sensorium club. It only lasted for about 9 months, okay? But life changed for me very quickly because all of a sudden in a month or two, it was on the cover of Life magazine and everybody would go to this club. It was sort of a cross between a club and a theater, including Jimi Hendrix one night. Now, Jimi used to also go to the Generation Club. In fact, I remember seeing Jimi as a sort of a startup left-handed guitar player because that's where you would go to see a Buddy Miles or Junior Wells play if you were interested in blues music. That was one of the clubs you would go to in New York. Jimi at the time and his manager essentially bought the club. They decided to take over the club. I never quite knew why. I always thought it was because his bar bill was too big, but that might be the stuff of mythology. Nobody's alive to even confirm whether that's true or not, so we'll just let that go. Converts the club and decides to find the person who did this club to go design his club. And literally, I got a call from his manager one day, "You want to do a club for Jimi Hendrix?" Seemed like an interesting project. And of course I said yes. I'm still only 22 years old. This is the only drawing that I have of the club. And what's interesting about it, and Jimi wanted everything to be curved and white and changing lights. And I think that's why he sort of lined himself up with that Cerebrum Club downtown. And so I did my best to, you would go down the stairs. I think you can jump ahead and realize that this club is essentially the site that becomes the studio. And we'll talk about that in 2 seconds. And the stage even was curved and the ceiling was curved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting was this word control room. So another idea that he had, and I believe his engineer producer Eddie Kramer had, was that they would record everything that was being done in the club. An idea that doesn't seem particularly novel today, but in 1968 and 1969, I think was a little bit on the novel side and probably wasn't even that easy to do. I just said, fine, we'll make a control room there. I had no idea what was going to go in that control room. And then literally life changed again in one of those extra serendipitous moments when, as fast as I was hired, I was fired because Eddie Kramer, his legendary Eddie Kramer, engineer producer, Jimi's engineer and co-producer, and of course went on to have an amazing career, pretty much demonstrated to Mike and Eddie that doing a club probably wasn't the smartest idea. I don't think Eddie really wanted to have too much to do with the club. He had just come over from England and wanted to have his own studio. And so convinced that team that the club was a bad idea, but it should really become a recording studio. And so my first big commission disappeared as fast as it came until they all sort of looked at me and said, "You can stay on and do the studio." I reminded them that I had actually never been in a studio. Somehow they said that was okay. I quit my day job in an architecture office, created my own internship working for an acoustician who knew a lot about isolation, and did all of his drafting for free in exchange for drawing Electric Lady Studios at night. And lo and behold, went back to Columbia University, studied as much as I could in the next 3 months, And somehow, with Eddie's help in particular, and some good fortune, managed to create Electric Lady Studios. This was the original design. You can already see some things that are changing. One is this big giant control room now. This has changed a few times. We'll talk about this ceiling in a minute in the big Studio A. You can still see some curves as leftover ideas from the club, and a Studio B, which more or less is still there, although the studio is now a control room, and the control room is now a studio, and various people have occupied it. Jack Antonoff is now the primary user of Studio B for the most part at Electric Lady. The live room has more or less remained unchanged all these years, and the stair is still the same stair. To this day, there's no elevator. I, for the life of me, can't figure out how that got through the New York City building department, but it still does. This is the original drawing. There's a younger version of me. There was a moment when we're going to try to get 3 studios on the ground floor. Eddie wisely, after we laid that out, talked everybody out of that idea. And in fact, that's the layout that we finally settled on. I always thought Eddie really was an architect at heart, disguising himself as a music engineer producer, but that's another story. Eddie and I patched up that little 11th hour argument, and we've become lifetime friends. And I think really the true hero of this story. Anyway, even the entrance was reflecting our ideas about curves. I was studying with Charlie Gwathmey at Princeton only a year earlier, and so I was very interested in curves, both in plan and in section, and we tried to emulate that. Unfortunately, this facade did not make it through. It didn't make it. It got torn down a while ago. Jimmy and Mike, his manager, never bought the building. To this day, the owners still don't own the building. It could be one of the great real estate boondoggles of all time. Been paying rent for 50 years, but clearly another story. Construction begins. We just show you a few slides here. It's a great site for a studio. Slab on grade, very tall ceilings, very few columns. Frederick Kiesler came from Europe. As some of you know, concrete is really developed in Europe. So he knew a lot about concrete, and the building was extremely well built. It was almost isolated enough, although we put in another extra ceiling. The construction was going to be sand-filled concrete blocks, still a construction technique we use with heavy isolation. It was pretty obvious we needed a lot of isolation between the 2 studios. These are the footings that were being dug for these forms to form between the 2 studios, A and B. And it is in one of these trenches one day when the machines were digging that, in fact, the water exploded and the rumor of us hitting a river underneath developed. In fact, it's really more of a water table. It probably was a river many years ago. It was probably the Minetta River. Now it's the sort of Minetta water table. And to this day, 2 pumps constantly pump water 24/7 out of the sump pumps. Some people think it's the water under the studio that gives it its characteristic sound. If you want to believe it, I'm okay with it, but I'm pretty sure that's not the reason. But it makes for some nice stuff. So some more construction photos. Very complicated air conditioning ductwork, which is still there 50 years later. Over a year later, the studio finally got finished. I love the black and white photos because it was Jimmy's idea that the studio would be black and white and would change color with lights. And in this ceiling, which was a sort of a leftover idea from the club, were sets of 3 sort of theatrical diachromatic bulbs designed by a great lighting designer, my partner for years, Bob Walsh, who's not with us anymore. And Eddie has told me many stories of Jimmy changing the lighting and changing the mood, et cetera, et cetera. But I like the black and white photos. This cloud is still there, and it is this cloud, it is this ceiling structure that actually is responsible for the sort of tight rock and roll sound in that room. Basically, the low frequency reverb time dies a little bit rather than expands. Without really knowing it, we had created a membrane absorber, okay, or a pressure absorber, which is a very efficient low frequency absorber. We sort of knew what we were doing, so a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of good luck. But that is, in fact, exactly what's going on in this room. And it was only 25 years after it opened that I finally got to measure it. Anyway, some more photos. You can see some leftover curve ideas from the club. I like these photos because it shows the studio messy. Studios are messy. We're going to see a lot of pictures of sort of glamour pictures of studios because those seem to be the ones we get, but the studios are workshops. They're supposed to be a little messy. Anyway, over the years, a lot of artists, not too many with Jimmy. Of course, as you know, Jimmy didn't get to appreciate the studio very long. There's a younger version of Eddie. And no, this is not the beginning of surround sound. Basically, stereo and mono is why there are 3 speakers up there. No surround sound in 1969. Lena Horne and Eddie, it's a great shot. Younger Led Zeppelins. And when Jimmy left, almost within months, Stevie, who was working uptown, moved in for a year and moved his giant synthesizer, Tanto, in there with Bob and Malcolm, and produced some great works there before he moved out to the West Coast. It was sort of like one Mozart left and another Mozart came in. It was extraordinary. This is a project studio, and this is the premise of my conversation today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It was built as a project studio, but the wisdom of mostly Eddie and Mike Jeffrey as manager, it was built to commercial specs. And I think that's probably what has saved Electric Lady all these years. But this is an original project studio for Jimmy. Jimmy didn't plan on leaving. He was obviously quite sudden. So for a long time, it remained a project studio, first for Jimmy, then for Stevie. And to this day, I think that's the vibe. If there's any vibe in the studio, it's because it is conceived as a musician's project studio. And lots of people have gone there. We could roll this forever, but no need. I like this slide because if you don't know who these people are, you have to leave. And so forth. This is a kind of cool shot. That's the studio, 4 or 5 years ago. The mural that was in the lobby that Jimmy commissioned finally got moved to the studio. I actually like it better in the studio. The partial wood and carpet floor, because we were nervous that the ceiling was not absorbent enough, finally got replaced with all wood because it turns out that the ceiling was absorptive enough. And of course, it's vibed out, run today by an amazing studio manager, Lee Foster, dear friend, and almost single-handedly saved the studio. I don't know if Lee is with us today, but he's certainly with me in spirit. I like these 2 shots together. I'm going to turn my phone off. Forgot to do that. I'm sorry. Okay. And this is an interesting shot because there's that facade only about 2 weeks before it was torn down. As I reminded myself, we tried famously, when we saw that the owner was going to tear it down. Why did he tear it down? Because he collapsed the theater, flattened the floor, and basically the theater doesn't exist anymore, which is an architectural nightmare just thinking about it. And it's become a health clinic, and he needed to change the front a little bit. And so this facade got in the way, and it's his building, and we tried to landmark it, but of no avail. But it's a great shot, and there's Eddie and I. And so we do have a surprise visitor. I have actually convinced Eddie to join us. I think he's here. I don't know if he actually got in. Justin, do you know if Eddie got here? Yep.
He should be joining us.
Okay. Edwin, hello. How are you, sir? Don't hear you, Eddie. You got to unmute.
Eddie, you're on mute.
I don't know if we can unmute Eddie. There we go.
Yep. Hi, guys. How are you?
How are you? Okay. Good to see you.
Thank you for inviting me.
I don't see Eddie too often. Eddie is in Toronto now. As I said, I wanted to strangle him for about 2 minutes one evening, one Sunday evening when he sort of fired me, but then he quickly rehired me and we remained friends for 50 years, I guess, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, I'm very proud to be the godfather of your daughter.
Yes, indeed.
And John and I have remained very close friends over the years. And life goes on, and we've done some studios together, and I continue to be working in the business. And here we are in the digital age at the time of COVID-19, and everybody's working in the box, and that's what we're up to.
So Eddie, I want to ask you a question. I've certainly never asked this question in front of 200 people, that's for sure. Okay. When you how did you really convince Jimmy and Mike not to build a club? And how the heck did you decide to let me stay on this project? I don't know if I've ever asked you that 50 years later.
Well, there's, yeah, everybody has a different perspective of how it was created. But the story that I can remember very clearly, when I walked down those stairs for the first time to meet Jim Marin, and I looked around the space, took some pictures and all the rest of that, you know, at the demolished sort of space. And I said to him, you know, you guys want to build a nightclub for Jimmy? That's crazy. You're out of your minds. Jimmy's spending at least $150,000 in 1969 dollars every year in the studio. Why don't we just build the best recording studio we possibly can for him, and forget the club, because the club is going to be a money pit. It'll never work. Plus, there's also the street was governed by, shall we say, some unsavory characters, and I think they would have put a stop to it, you know, having a nightclub there. There would have been a lot of competition. Yeah, probably. And they turned to me and they said, you know, that's a great idea. Okay, let's make a studio. We'll scrap the club. And then somebody had the unenviable job of calling you and telling you that. But then once that happened, yeah, it became very exciting because it's a whole new thing now.
Yeah, I've always maintained, I didn't realize that what was actually being built was a project studio. Mainly because the term didn't exist. I mean, no. We toured 3 or 4, there weren't very many studios in New York at the time. They were all commercial studios.
But they were horrible, John. They were boxes. They were
very boring. And, you know, since I didn't have anything to base it on, Jimmy was all about vibe. I mean, you know, till his last day, he was only about vibe. And technology, loved technology, of course, as you know. So it didn't really, there was no difference between, it didn't occur to me to make anything other than a project studio that had flavor and tone and color and you know, was sort of like a home for him. Also, we remind ourselves, it was really the first studio below 42nd Street. There were no studios it was in Greenwich Village. It still is, of course, in Greenwich Village. Eddie, I know you have to get back to work. I'm going to kick you out. I had a couple
quick things. Eddie, John Herder says hi, and Charles Root says it's PG Tips time. Putting the kettle on.
Hey, okay. I live for my cup of tea. I can't work without tea.
So Eddie, thank you for. I know you had a break in a session, and
chat more. I really would.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool that you're working and mixing. We're going to drag you in. We have a technology webinar coming up about long distance mixing, and we're going to drag you in for, we'll time it so that you can spend a full hour with us, because I know you've been learning some extraordinary techniques now.
I have to say that my whole life has changed because of that. I'm working out of my house. I'm sitting here actually in AJ's office with a couple of speakers, my laptop, and a couple of devices. I have my engineer who's 15 minutes away in his studio, and we can control. We just did a session the other day. It's our first live session. We're here in Toronto. The band's down in Arkansas. And for 2 days, we controlled the session from our laptops. And it was wonderful. We tracked the song and we overdubbed it. It wasn't without its minor problems, you know, because of the internet and all the rest of that. But we got great sounds. The band was happy, and it was. I wish I could have been in the room with them, but it was the closest thing I could have gotten.
You will be in the room again. There'll be, and there's a time and a place for both models. It talks to the point that I want to talk to later. Anyway, say goodbye. Give a hug to AJ. AJ is Eddie's wife. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you, sir.
Ciao.
Okay, great. Thanks. Anyway, so I like this picture. Actually, I should have brought this up while Eddie was on it, because Eddie took this picture and he always reminds me that I owe him some royalties for it, but I'm not going to give him a penny. Anyway, we're not going to talk about very much acoustics because we simply don't have time. Obviously, acoustics are what we are dwelling on all the time. This may be the most important slide, which is to sort of understand what world you're in. Are you talking about isolation acoustics or internal room acoustics, keeping rooms quiet, or how does sound behave in a room. A lot of people get these confused. Try not to use the word soundproofing. That's just a horrible word because it doesn't really mean anything. It means too many things to too many different people. Let's just look at an example of very heavy isolation design, which usually results in mass and decoupling. And you don't always need isolation design. I mean, if you're in a quiet space or if you're working in the box, then you can skip these slides and you can also save yourself a lot of money. But that may not always be the case. If you're in a commercial environment or you're in a noisy environment, then you are going to have to isolate your rooms so that open microphones are not disturbed. Okay, here's a case, an example. This is Electronic Arts, their recording studio complex. And you can just see in the drawing how complicated this wall might end up being between this control room and this studio. Okay, that's the wall right there. That's a very complicated, it's actually a 3-wall system, and the middle wall is actually 2 walls. But notice the floors, they're just split concrete slabs, for those of you who can read architectural drawings. This is the same technique that was used at Electric Lady, still the best, I think. Just make the floors separate, which of course explains why if you're on the lowest level in your building, okay, you have the option to do this. It's a little hard to split floors when you're on an upper level. So that's always going to be the best site. Electric Lady was a fantastic site for a studio. Eddie was right. He was intuitively correct. I don't know if he knew all the science, but he was certainly intuitively correct. And you can see how complicated it might be to isolate rooms with springs and lid ceilings, et cetera, et cetera. So this drawing is more sort of to scare everybody into that. It's not for the faint. It's not, if you need a lot of isolation, try to go get some help or just be aware that it's tricky stuff. But it does not affect the interior of the studios. And this is the drawings that I've been showing you. This is that studio. Okay, it doesn't affect most of what you see here. It has to do with interior room acoustics or architecture or vibe. So one does not have to eliminate the rest. Let me get that guy out of there. Okay, so let's.
Hey, John, we have a question coming in from John Herder.
Okay.
He says, can you quickly comment on heavy construction / isolation and its impact on low frequency, pros, cons to the interior acoustic performance for tracking rooms?
Yeah, that's easy. The low frequency behavior, 2 things are going to affect low frequency behavior. Your internal room acoustics, which is going to be about 10 slides from now. Basically, how do we control what a lot of people call standing waves or eigentones? How do we control how low frequencies are contained in the room once they're generated in the room? The other way is interference from low frequency, i.e. low frequency transmission from a subway or from yourself, like a control room, okay? And if we just focus on B, which is the sort of transfer or isolation issue, heavier construction is usually always going to be superior. It's why if we're going to have a lot of low frequency energy, say it's an urban studio, very high levels of monitoring, et cetera, I try to stay away from a wood frame building, for instance. It's not that we couldn't figure out how to do it. We just have to work really, really hard. It'd be a lot easier to be slab on grade, heavy construction, heavy lids, isolated room within room construction. But for instance, if it's a broadcasting studio where 84 dB is 0, you're not going to be working at exceptionally loud levels, then it's more appropriate to use lighter construction. But none of this has really very much to do with how low frequency energy is generated in the room and then how it behaves, particularly when it comes back to a listening position. That's modal analysis, commonly called standing wave behavior. I hate that name. And so there's sort of 2 different universes. Okay, obviously heavy construction is usually more expensive. In the United States, it's tricky. And also you might not be in a building where you're able to do it. So you have to weigh the 2. Okay, short answer to a complicated question. Happy to continue this conversation with whoever asked that with an email. I might as well say that to everybody. By now, I hope you realize I love this subject. Could talk about it for hours and enjoy doing that.
Yeah, just a quick note on that. We are tracking all of the Q&A. And so if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we will be able to follow up individually after the fact.
So again, this is the control room from that complicated, isolated detail. And again, very little of what you're seeing here has very much to do with isolation, mostly interior room acoustics. So obviously this is a subject I've been chasing for years. So enough for that. Now let's talk about internal room acoustics. How do things behave in a room? Well, that's even more complicated, and there's a lot of metrics that we can discuss: reverb time, decay rate, clarity. I mentioned before that the sort of secret sauce at Electric Lady was the lowering of the reverb time as you go down to low frequencies. This is contrary to concert halls, okay, and contrary to a lot of rooms where people put a lot of velocity absorption, like foam and curtains. Okay, if you're going to get a room to have a lowered reverb time at low frequencies, you need to put in low frequency absorption of some sort, either very, very big traps or membrane absorbers and resonators. Okay, thin low frequency absorption has been what we've been chasing for years. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Anyway, thank you, Peter D'Antonio, for actually drawing this. I believe these are the 4 tools we have. We have geometry as a tool, which I think is the most exciting tool. I'm a little partial to that because I'm an architect by training. The shape of our rooms, which also means the positioning of speakers and listeners. So that's geometry, okay? And then we can take surfaces and make them reflective, absorptive, or diffusive on a frequency by frequency basis. By that, I mean a particular surface could behave reflective. It could be reflective at one frequency and absorptive at another. Carpet would be an example of a material that's completely reflective at 60 hertz and completely absorptive at 4,000 hertz. Same material. So now things get very complicated just with these 4 tools only. Okay, and these are the tools that we're using. Okay, let's just look at one example of how the frequencies can be affected by a time domain event, and that's about all we're going to do. I promise to put very little math up here. Okay, we could spend hours and hours talking, but let's just look at one item that happens so frequently in control rooms, which is sort of comb filtering effect. Most people on this here are going to know what a comb filter is. This is the math behind a comb filter. If you are familiar with this, that's fine. If not, just wink and don't leave. Okay, and it's called a comb filter because essentially it generates a filter that looks like a comb. Flanging is basically what this sort of is. So this would be fun as an effect, but you certainly don't want your room to be doing this without your permission. What would cause this? Well, what would cause this would be a reflection bouncing off of a surface like a console and arriving just a little bit later in time at almost the same level, just like we're seeing here. So this purple route is just a little bit further than the yellow route, probably by 3 or 4 feet. And just to make things simple, let's pretend that sound is at 1,000 feet per second, which it's not, but it's close. So 1 foot is about a millisecond, and you can quickly see that things are going to be 4, 5, 6 milliseconds delayed. And that's going to be a kind of a comb filtering effect. It's a time domain effect that will get transferred into the frequency domain. This explains why more or less every speaker that's mounted high off of a big piece of glass is never going to be accurate. I don't care how much you tune it. And everybody who's mixed on big speakers knows that, which is why they end up not mixing on them. You might track on them, but you never mix on them. I even walked into a room once with Bob Margaloff, Stevie Wonder's extraordinary producer and engineer, and watched him put a packing blanket down on top of a console once because he heard something. And of course, what he was hearing was a comb filter. How do we get rid of that problem? Well, one way to get rid of it is to just make the rooms bigger. Well, that's good. So that does work sometimes. Or another way is to choose a console that might block this path. Some of the older Neves do that. Or lower the speaker into the glass, which is a kind of a contradiction to put the speaker in the glass. Maybe the glass could become the speaker, or maybe I'm getting a little bit of ahead of myself here. Okay. And of course, that would make the problem go away. So there's an example, not a particularly elegant one, but one that at least did the job. Another reason why those big Augsburger type horn speakers, put the horns on the bottom, get that low as possible. Okay. And of course, another way is to just not have any glass. There's no argument against ear level monitoring. It's hard to argue against ear level monitoring because you won't have a console reflection. okay? The ubiquitous near field speaker, which of course there's thousands and thousands of them, and I'm not gonna argue that people don't make great records on near field monitors on consoles, but this is in fact often what's happening. I think a lot of people actually have got their ears tuned to this anomaly, but that's another conversation. Whereas this could easily go away by just taking your near field monitor and pushing it back, okay? And so I believe that this is a more appropriate solution for monitors rather than putting them on top of a speaker. We got a little demonstration here. This is that's probably an NS10 or some sort of near field monitor. Pretty good, pretty flat, rolls off at the low end, okay? And this is what happens when you put it on top of a big console like an SSL. Nothing against SSL, just a big console that's basically a piece of metal. Look at the behavior here and look at the frequencies where this is. Now we made a recording, we enhanced it. We sort of took this filter and just embellished it a little bit so that you could understand it. Let's take a look at what the speech should sound like.
A king ruled the state in the early days. The ship was torn apart on the sharp reef. Sickness kept him home.
And this is what happens as it goes, as when that monitor is on top of the console.
A king ruled the state in the early days. The ship was torn apart on the sharp reef.
Now we've enhanced it a little bit. And if anybody that wants to explore this a little bit more, I can send you a copy of this, and we've got some music examples also. This is an easy demonstration to try. There's lots of things that can be causing comb filtering in studios: ceilings that are too low, racks that are uneven, racks that are too high, back walls that are too close. Try and steer away from it, okay? Anyway, that's enough for mid and high frequency. Let's look at low frequencies, which of course is the bane of our existence. This is where we are now spending most of our time, and by the way, most of our research. Our third talk in our series will deal very, very specifically with low frequency analysis. It's become really important for us because studios have gotten smaller. So as studios got smaller, the ability to have very deep traps, which is essentially velocity absorption, deep traps, has disappeared because the rooms are getting smaller. So we need thin, low frequency absorption. There are really only two ways that I know to do that, either with Helmholtz type absorbers or membranic absorbers. And each of those have their advantages and disadvantages, but they can be thin. Thin means maybe 8 inches or less, okay? So take a quick look at this. Now let's not get don't get scared by this math. This is the last math you're gonna see, okay? So ray trace or high frequency or statistical acoustics, basically things bouncing off of walls, is very useful at high frequencies. But as you go down in frequency, it becomes very unuseful, okay? Until when you get to very low frequencies, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. All that matters is room ratios and geometry of transducers, sending and receiving transducers, speakers and ears. Whereas modal analysis or eigentone analysis or standing wave analysis, if you want to use that term, is all that matters at low frequencies. And as you go higher and higher, because the modes get more packed, because the math is arithmetic, if you do the math on modal analysis, it's arithmetic. And of course, you have more frequencies as you move up in each octave band. You finally get to a point where that also doesn't mean anything. Where they cross is loosely called the Schroeder frequency. This is the math behind it. Who cares how we got to it? But take a look at where the size of the room is. V is volume. So as the room gets bigger, the Schroeder frequency gets smaller because it's on the bottom. That's all I really want to show you here. I don't care about anything else, okay? So the opposite is true. As rooms get smaller, the Schroeder frequency gets higher. This is why small rooms are actually harder to contain low frequencies, because you have to pay more attention to more frequencies because the Schroeder frequency is up. In most of our kind of control rooms, the 200-300 square foot rooms, the kind of rooms that we have thousands and thousands of, this is in the 200 hertz, 250 hertz kind of range. But as rooms get smaller, that can actually get higher. This is a very, very interesting graph that we prepared, and we always calculate all of our modal analysis right out to the Schroeder frequency. And now we're doing it a little bit beyond, okay? So here's a simple demonstration. Here's a 20 by 20 foot room that happened to be in a basement. And no matter what you do here, look at how the modes are going to get piled up. They have to get piled up. Two of the dimensions are the same. But if you plot them on a log scale, notice as you move out in frequency that they're getting packed by definition, because the log scale packs the frequencies. This is closer to how we listen. And you're going to get to a point where they're packed so closely that it doesn't matter. You can demonstrate this for yourself. Take a 50 hertz tone and a 60 hertz tone and play them together, and you're going to hear a real difference. Take a 2000 hertz tone and a 2010 hertz tone and play them together, and you probably won't be able to hear the difference. Maybe just a slight beating. But if we took and put a closet in the room, basically somebody called one day and asked me what I should do, and I said, build a closet. Now, this room no longer is a square. It has a much better room ratio. Put a little bit of absorption on the side here, okay? So that we don't have any immediate reflections off of a speaker, okay? Maybe some diffusion, or maybe half diffusion, half absorption on the back. Make it possibly wider than deeper. That's a trick sometimes we like to do because the side walls are further apart. And you have a much better chance of this room behaving. So room ratios and geometry are really the trick. But we need targeted low frequency absorption based on our calculations. We have a lot of tools at our disposal. Let me show you an example. Here's a very small room that we could not really change very much after we designed it. This is one of the rooms in Paul Epworth's church studios in London. This is his writing room. He spends most of his time here. And here's a blow up diagram that shows these surfaces are actually perforated resonators of two different kinds. This one, let me just slide that guy down. This is designed to have its peak absorption around 63 hertz, and this one at 125 hertz. So by mixing and matching different perforations or different resonator designs, we can balance the required low frequency absorption or dampening to get this room to work. We have a lot of great tools at our disposal right now. We as a company are working on a new piece of software that we're going to be announcing pretty soon, and we're going to be sharing that in webinar number 3. So this is exciting to see the ability to have thin, low frequency targeted absorption to make these small rooms work. This is the future. This is what's really going on. There's 10,000 rooms like this. Where Eddie is working, okay, or where his team is working, probably has a low frequency bump that he's kind of working around or figuring out how to work around, okay? And this is exciting stuff, I think, as we go forward into the future. Okay, so again, how did we get from here to here to here to here? And this is the control room inside Jazz at Lincoln Center, okay? This is one of the rooms that control room records. Very exciting room on top of the Time Warner building in New York. Okay, there it is right there. It's now used by XM Radio, as they record out of it, but it's also their radio station. And it looks into Wynton Marcellus's rehearsal room, as well as some smaller rooms. So again, how did this happen? This is the premise of my conversation with you today, that we've always been making project studios and that we always will be making project studios. It doesn't mean that they're small or they're big or they're commercial or they're non-commercial. These are political terms. These are business terms, okay? Our very dear friend Chris Stone, not with us anymore, immortalized or memorialized this concept with a great article he wrote years ago called Motherships and Satellites. I believe that was the title, where he suggested that there are always going to be large mothership studios that need to have big rooms, that need to have highly specialized equipment, and that there'll be thousands of satellite studios, which are what we're now calling project studios or home studios. But my premise is that we will continue to have more and more studios, and that they will all need to contain vibe and personality. In fact, I think I want to go one step further and suggest that that will be the only thing that separates one studio from another, because all studios have extraordinary equipment. The equipment is almost fungible. I mean, it's like 1/10 the price it was 50 years ago, and is continuing to get better and going down. And thanks to conversations like the one we're having today, thanks to the work that we're doing and other people in our industry are doing, thanks to the schools, thanks to the literature, the acoustics continue to get better and better. We have better tools and it's more democratic. Okay, we'll discuss that in a little bit also. In other words, lots of people can make measurements. It's not a secret anymore. There's no voodoo. For years, I think people genuinely believe that the subway 200 meters away from Electric Lady, plus the river underneath the floor, and Jimmy's vibe in the walls was the reason why the studio was successful. That's ridiculous. I'm not saying that maybe those things don't exist, but the reason why the room works is because of the ceiling. But I didn't know that until we were able to measure it. Once you can measure things, you can share the information. I still want to think that Jimmy is in the wall somewhere. Anyway, let's go take a look at some studios. And we're just going to flash through these. They have very little in common other than our group worked on them. They're all different and they're all supposed to be different. You'll see a lot of clouds in our studios. This is where we tend to hide low frequency absorption. Okay. We tending to try to get away from fabric. Fabric is expensive. It wears out. It's not even ecologically that good. It's tough to clean. We much more prefer perforated and slotted wood or solid materials. I think they're much more durable, and that technology has really, really grown of recent. Glass does not have to be your enemy. As a matter of fact, it can be your friend. The trick in this room is this little gray box right there. That little box right there, okay? And I actually believe that I can draw, since I do draw for a living. There it is, right there. It's hanging, is a perforated, micro-perforated piece of plastic, and it's right there in plan. A symmetrical one is over there. If you take these away, you get harsh first-order comb filter bounces off of this window and off of this window right here because you look into that studio. Okay, but just by hanging those, that micro-perf piece of plastic has the same properties as a piece of foam, except you can look through it. So yes, we have absorptive glass or absorptive transparency, okay? And it is available. It's a little pricey, but we don't need very much of it. Very low ceiling. Could have put absorption on it, didn't put diffusion on it. Makes the room much more musical, much richer. This is up in an attic, right up here, overlooking the Hudson River. Hollywood, Beverly Hills. Here's a church that has its own studio. You can see it right here. Great little studio. And there it is with a control room. Very, very little treatment, mostly done in geometry with 3 characteristic ceiling clouds and a very cool little 5-person recording studio with some variable acoustic panels on the wall. Sometimes this is in Bronx, in the Latin section of Bronx. And sometimes they're doing Latin music, but then sometimes they need the room to be a little bit deader. So they bring in gobos and carpets, open up these doors, and the room gets very, very dead. We split this sound lock into 2 sound locks, each with a mic panel, okay? And even put a little mic panel here. So all of a sudden, they've got quite a bit of variety in where they can record, and a little bit of a lounge, all under about 900 square feet. This is a project studio, but it's inside a church. Here's a person who actually bought a church that went out of business to make a commercial recording studio. And of course, the last thing we were going to do was change the interior of the church. But when measuring this room, again, we noticed the characteristic lowering of the reverb time at the low end. Why? Because there's an 8-foot attic on top of this wood ceiling, which is actually on the thin side. So that an attic and that thin wood, relatively thin wood ceiling is essentially acting as a low frequency absorber, okay? And
John, just a quick time check. We're at 9:55.
Well, we're gonna go over a little bit. People can stay, okay? We're gonna go over everybody, but actually,
For anyone who can't stay beyond that, we will be posting the recording of the entire session.
but please
on
stay.
our site.
Yeah, we're gonna post it. I told everybody that I was gonna be an hour, but everybody that knows me knew I was lying, so doing the best I can. There's a studio in Italy, okay, with these identical mixing rooms. This was Alair Studios overlooking the Ashokan Reservoir, which is New York City's water, where we built an entire new control room and added it to this room right here. and because we were chasing this gigantic barn, which again, we did very little work to other than just restore it. And that's the control room. This is the sunroom where we threw an extra layer of glass, and that's not PowerPoint, that's not Photoshop, that's the Catskill Mountains. Two film composers in Buenos Aires, each with their own control room, sharing a studio. We do this quite often. Most of the time they're in their studios. And when I asked them if they preferred to look forward or sideways, one of them said, I don't care. And the other one said, I have to look forward. So that's exactly what we did. And then we made this the sort of surround mixing room. That's another debate that we often ask. Should we look forward into the live room, or do we even need a live room? Okay. You know, Justin, that poll about the monitoring would be a good one to do right now. We should have popped that up before. I don't know whether you are able to do the poll. There we go. We're interested to know how people think about polling. I guess I have to answer it also, right? In order to get this thing off.
Oh, John, I'm sorry. I did not enable polling for you.
Oh, so I can just.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, my opinion doesn't matter. Let's continue. We're just going to flash some of these up. And this is in rural Vermont. Didn't really need this window right here, but of course I wanted it for symmetry. There is no argument against symmetry in control rooms, not that I know of. And so I convinced the owner that it would be nice to look into the fireplace here, which ended up being a nice thing, but I really cared about the glass. Notice this room wider than deeper. There's a rendering of it. And the studio. A nice, beautiful expansion to an East Hampton studios. Cynthia Daniels, a Grammy Award-winning engineer out there. Again, Cynthia only really wanted one vocal booth. That's really her business. And I talked her into two, and then I talked her into making them a little bit bigger, and now she has a real recording studio. And there it is. Picture of Cynthia and my wife. That's Beth Walters right there, who's been my partner for 33 years. And if you see a studio that sort of looks kind of cool with color and texture, it's probably because of Beth. Oh, there's our poll results. Very interesting. You're going to save these, right, Justin, I guess?
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Very interesting. I would tend to agree with that. Very interesting. Green Day's, one of Green Day's studios in Oakland, Jay-Z studio, which is not there anymore, Rock the Mic in New York. That's a low frequency absorber right there, which Jay-Z thought it was a duct, and he said, let's leave it, but it's actually a 5-inch thick low frequency membrane absorber. Okay, so this is there just to sort of disguise it. Notice the near field, the ear level monitoring. We're able to do that with the angled frames. That's a trick we do a lot. Okay, so by that, it allows people to see quite a bit of the studio, but gives us all this real estate to put the speaker. So now I don't have to put the speaker above the glass. Also much cheaper to install, much cheaper, order of magnitude. And we're doing this a lot. Little extra work on the window, but it pays off acoustically and it pays off installation-wise. As opposed to, this is one of Timbaland's early studios. Jimmy Douglas was the engineer, where Jimmy wanted to look forward through a big piece of glass. So we, of course, the characteristic Augsburger horn lower, and the console is back a little bit further. So we do our best to eliminate a console bounce. Interesting studio in Argentina, one of our first studios, where all these doors open. Every single one of these opposing wood doors open, and the ceiling on motors flip. We saw this studio already. And there's a studio shot. This room can go from about 0.4 seconds to 0.9 seconds, just by changing the doors and the ceiling and bringing in some rugs. A very valuable tool, depending on what kind of recording you want to do. And we try to introduce as much variable acoustics as possible. This was a studio built for Fido Paez. Again, a project studio, okay, that's been used commercially. This is the name of the studio is Paradise Garage, because it actually is in a garage right there. you're going to start to see a trend here. Okay. Notice extra room in the studio now, because all the work is kind of being done in the control room. There's a tiny little vocal booth that he really uses more as an amp closet. Okay. Studio in Brazil. Beautiful, beautiful building. Let's take a look at the studio. Again, look at how big this control room is, because most of the recording is done in the control room. There's a live room that's set up here for the photo, but quite a bit is done here. Okay. And then, of course, many of you recognize the second floor, not the SSL room, but the second floor of Paul Epworth's church studios. Paul bought the Eurythmic studio, where, again, this one room, control room studio concept has now been taken to the max. And this is becoming quite common. And this is an analog studio, not working in the box. That's a Neve, actually a double Neve console. Okay. Obviously, when they monitor, they put phones on. When they're tracking, when they mix in a normal configuration. And this is becoming quite common. And Justin, this is an interesting time. There you go. This is another poll that we're very interested to see what people in this conversation think about. We, of course, have a lot of opinions on it because we get a lot of calls from people wanting different configurations, separate control room, live room, control room, combination control room, live room with a small ISO booth, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe this simple poll can help us get a little bit further in our research. So you're helping us just to get a little bit smarter. And then, of course, right below this is the other rooms that we saw one of them, and we'll see another one in a little while. One of Alicia Key's earlier studios with Annie Mincielli, her lifetime engineer and producer. This is the first duality in New York City. Again, ear level monitoring. Again, this was the first time we tried that angled glass. And that again gives us nice vision into most of the studio, but still allows our monitors to be low. We had no choice here. There was no way we could even put monitors above the glass because there was no ceiling height. And a very cool treatment in the back here, kind of a combination Helmholtz resonator for low frequency absorption and a polycylindrical diffuser for reflection. Well, now that's interesting. I did not expect that result. Okay. All right. So on my WSDG team, we're going to have to change our thinking here. But thank you, everybody, for jumping in on that poll. I really appreciate that. Justin, if people come in later, does it get revised? I guess it does.
I have to close the polls out, but please, if you didn't get to poll, I leave them up for about a minute.
Okay.
Feel free to put a comment in the Q&A.
Yeah, great. More studios. This is actually Berkeley's studio in Valencia. And this is their newest studio. This may be one of the largest studio complexes in America, ironically, for a school in the basement, 2 basement levels of this dormitory building in Boston. Fantastic rooms. We have a big scoring room here and another studio over here. And on another floor, we have a film mixing room over here. Very interesting concept. Here are some of them. Again, all ear level monitoring with that angled frame. And then the characteristic cloud with low frequency absorption above it. This is their signature scoring room. So those squares on the ceiling, besides being kind of cool looking and providing panels for our lights and our sprinkler heads, are low frequency absorbers. They are 3 different thicknesses of plywood, which have been designed and tuned to deal with low frequency absorption, along with this Helmholtz resonator wall. That's all that's doing it. Very little trapping, very little big bass traps. There's a little bit going on here, but mostly what's going on here is air conditioning. Okay, very efficient and very nice architectural element. There's their mix room. NYU studios. I put this one up because it does show a very interesting characteristic. When you come out of the elevator, they wanted to see into the control room. But I needed a diffuser on the back of this long, skinny control room, which, by the way, is that long because the teaching requirement is 15 chairs. Not my favorite way of teaching in a control room, but that's NYU's methodology, and we respect that. These big, thick walls are giant 10-foot trusses that hold up the rest of the building. Okay, and so there was no way this could be made wider. So we have a lot of low frequency issues to deal with here. And this is what you see. basically, when you come out, we made the diffuser out of clear plastic. Diffusers don't really care what they're made out of. They're really geometric objects. They just have to be, they could be out of wood, aluminum, concrete, plastic. And so you do look forward and look right into this amazing room, which is actually a 12, I think it's a 12.4.2 room. NYU has a very extended immersive audio program. And so this is the control room that they look into, and that's the studio right over here that they can see into through some openings in that truss that we were able to get. Okay, these are absorbers and reflectors at the same time. So what can we look forward to? Let's just jump to the future, because that was the promise. Okay, well, I think these are 5 things we can look forward to. Some we've touched on. The universe of prefabricated acoustic materials has exploded, and it's extraordinary. Be a little careful on the web. I mean, be careful in general on the web. There's a lot of voodoo up there. But if you ask for data and a manufacturer sends you the data and you learn how to read the data, which is not impossible, then you can trust it. And this is what I call the democratization of acoustical engineering. So we're expecting this world to grow in an extraordinary manner. This is even more exciting, which is low frequency control. By that, I mean thin, low frequency absorbers, basically pressure absorbers, either membranes or resonators. Okay, and we have a number of companies that are leaders in that field as well. This is a sort of boring, no one cares about this field, but if you need isolation, you care about it if you get it wrong, I can tell you that. Okay, and even this world is getting better. There used to be two manufacturers that made soundproof doors. Now there's 20. So you tell me what happens when 20 people make the same kind of object. But these are the most exciting ones. The computer-aided measuring systems, and this is what makes our universe absolutely more democratic. So this guy right here, I'm just picking up my cell phone, okay, with $30 or $40 worth of software on it, has more measuring capacity than anything I had 25 years ago, okay? And it allows you to have it as well. We can do FFT measurements, SPL measurements, RTA, NC measurements, isolation measurements, all on a cell phone within 1 or 2 dBs. And you can even calibrate your cell phone, okay, against the sound level meter. I mean, we have obviously much more serious equipment, but everybody in our firm carries a cell phone. I'm constantly trying to find out how loud things are and making measurements. So this is very exciting. And this is clearly the most exciting one, predictive software, the ability to predict, the ability to predict how our rooms will sound before we build them from our drawings. And of course, this is what we've always wanted. And so we'll be expecting these headlines. Here we go. This one has to do with an auditorium. We can plan our buildings, we can plan our rooms with really, really good acoustics. We don't have to guess at them anymore. This headline we're not going to see because this one already happened about 105 years ago when Wallace Sabine, the person who the Sabine is named after, the measure of absorption, announced 2 to 3 years worth of work in Boston, okay, and essentially developed the core, still seminal theory on reverb time, basically the equation or the algorithm that links absorption on surfaces to volume to its behavior. Okay, and we've been using that algorithm and variations on that algorithm for years, more or less unchanged. We've certainly built on it with other types of knowledge, okay? But we've gotten a lot better and a lot smarter. I love this demonstration because this has been going on now for 10 or 15 years and continues to get better, which is how we can oralize drawings. Let's look at this demonstration because it's really easy to do. So here's a church in Switzerland. Any of you architecture buffs, if you think this is a Corbusier Ronchop copy, it's not, although it's only about 20 miles away. But there's the inside of the church. And you can guess what this sounds like. I mean, there's not an absorptive material here. This is concrete, wood, plaster, stone, concrete, and even the ceiling are slatted pieces of wood every 3 or 4 inches that are hung from a concrete roof, namely that roof. Okay, so this is not going to sound so good. Now, most of you are going to be able to read this graph. I'm going to just get back into my arrow. Okay, and this is not tenths of a second, everybody. This is seconds. Madison Square Garden, I think, is 3 seconds. I think it's that kind of number. So this is, I mean, here's the male voice around 500. That's 6 seconds. So let's listen to what this room sounds like. That's a little pink noise that we just let loose through a sound system. And then let's listen to some vocal.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Well, that's exactly what it would sound like. And that is, in fact, exactly what it does sound like, until somebody woke up and said, we need to make some changes, unless we just want to put 100 speakers everywhere or give everybody headphones. And so we oralized or modeled this space. This is what it looks like. It kind of looks like a wireframe diagram. There's a number of software programs that do this. We're not going to talk about that right now. And by dividing the space into a certain number of segments, of surfaces, and then attaching characteristics to those surfaces, we can begin to approximate, to create an impulse response from the drawing. We have to have a send and receive position. Everybody here kind of knows what an impulse response is, I hope. And then we can send a calibrated recording back through this impulse response, computer technique, and we can listen to the room. We can listen to that sound being simulated in that room. Let's go do that. So first of all, the computer can do all this, but the computer cannot generate your goals. Luckily, we still need people for this. So the goal has to be something that you either think of, or you dream, or you went to another church, or you looked it up. Or in this case, we kind of looked up and said there's only one surface we can change, which is the ceiling. It was pretty obvious that we were going to take down the wood, put up some absorption, and put the wood back. So essentially, we calculated what that would be. And then let's see if it sounds okay. Let's see if the goal curve is okay. So let's listen now. So this is through a drawing. This is through the oralized model. And you can already begin to hear, this is not going to sound as good. Most of you are listening on laptops.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
You hear much more articulation with a little bit of reverberation. What's interesting about this demonstration is that even if we could have made it deader, I don't think we would have. So not only was it proof of concept, and not only was it a design tool, but it was a halt to any more design. There's no reason to make this any deader. This is a church. It should have a little bit of reverb, and the churches are supposed to be a little reverberant. And that's exactly what we did. We closed the church one summer. They took down all the wood, put up the insulation. By the way, the program helped us to calculate some air spacing between the insulation. It wasn't all at the same depth. And then when people came back in a few months later, it looked exactly the same, because it was exactly the same, except it sounded better. So this is a tool. This is a tool that we used for frequencies from Schroeder up. From Schroeder down, we have to use another set of tools, including some new ones that we're developing. And when you marry the two, we're working on trying to oralize them both all the way down to the lowest frequency. We're not quite there yet, but I think we're going to be there within a year or two. We're working very, very hard on it. It's a very exciting moment for us right now. Here were the curves. Look at, this is of course the first curve that we started with, and look how accurate this was. This was extraordinary. That's the name of the software, CAT. So anyway, we did this again when we designed this studio in China, and of course long distance. This is a rendering of what this huge complex was going to look like. There's the front door, giant 2,000 square foot orchestra rehearsal and recording room with 2 big control rooms. So this room had to be a rock and roll room, but also had to be the rehearsal room and recording room for the Guangzhou Orchestra. So their requirements are really, really different than rock and roll requirements. And so what we started doing was, there's our model, which sort of looks a little bit like a 3D model. And we started sending files back and forth with various treatments and various arrangements of variable acoustics until we got the conductor happy and our client happy, who was a sort of well-known rock and roll star from Hong Kong. I'm just going to do one demonstration, and if people are more interested in this, please get in touch with us and we'll send you this file. Take a look at the brightest way, the livest recording that you could put the drums in. So if Eddie Kramer was using this room, he would want the room in the brightest arrangement, the least amount of absorption. He'd put that microphone way up at the top like he's done for 50 years, along with his closed mics. Then he'd mix them with his sauce and his magic way of doing it. And so we want the drums to sound like this. But I imagine if some producers from Nashville came, they probably would not want that. They want that drum to be tight and dead, or maybe some other producers. And so we would draw curtains, flip some panels, bring in gobos, rugs, et cetera, and this is what we could get the drums to sound like. Much tighter. So once again, not only nice variable acoustic tools, but proof of design. And this was being done long distance on the other side of the world until we finally got agreement from our client, which in a sense was two clients. This is the building that they bought for the studio, which they thought was fantastic, until I reminded them that it really was a piece of junk and it wasn't really worth even building. So they tore it down and built one that looked more or less the same. That's the rules in China. And once again, we're using the same construction technique that we did at Electric Lady. Sand-filled concrete block, in this case, 4 walls, 1, 2, a corridor, 3, 4. So it was a 4-wall system so that all 3 of these spaces, the big studio and the 2 control rooms, could work simultaneously at very high levels. Okay, that talks to that question about low frequency isolation that was asked earlier. So there's a sort of modern version of the same building, all built out of concrete, beautiful clear story light up at the top, which you'll see later on. Looks really good in the room. Here it is being built. I just thought it would be interesting. These are membrane absorbers right here on that high ceiling. There's the rendering, but there they are being built. Okay. The people who built this had never built a studio before. It was extraordinary effort. Look at the workmanship on this 4-window, a 3-glass 4-wall system. Really extraordinary. Compound, not only angling away, like we've talked about so many times, but also angling up. Very difficult. There's a rendering of the corridor system. That was the solution, was to put a corridor between the rooms so you could see through them. And then there it is being built. Control room renderings, studio renderings, and the final design. That's our rock and roll client, Hins Jiang, and then the conductor, whose name I forget, also had his requirements. And of course, the picture was taken at night, and there's all the windows. So very exciting to build in China. So more future, immersive. And this, I think, maybe wait a few slides and we'll get to our third poll, because I'm really interested in this one. Now we're in the cowboy country here. Where are we going with surround or 3D or multi-speaker or immersive? Fasten your seatbelts. I'm not sure if anybody really knows where this is going. We've been in the immersive audio world for quite some time. Films have, of course, been doing it. Now Atmos, Oro, but 5.1 film technology has been here for a long time. So it's not new to the film world. It's gotten some rocky starts in the music world. We've seen rooms like this. I believe the minute that there's a ubiquitous solution, a hands-on, everybody accepting solution for immersive sound from earbuds, and those solutions are on the market right now. Everybody knows that. Still not quite sure about the head transfer function issue, but the minute this happens, everybody will want immersive sound and everybody will be stepping up the ante on those mixes. This is my personal belief. It's gotten some false starts. It's sort of like color TV. When it first came out, it was not really better than black and white TV, but then it got good. And now nobody buys black and white TV anymore. I mean, you might want to see an old black and white movie because of a historical reason, okay? And so this will happen, okay? How are we going to produce immersive audio? We've been doing it for a long time. Here's some examples of surround rooms. Let me get this picture over here. Okay, this is a stereo room, and when it needs to be a 5.1 room, they just pop up. This is kind of cool. Most of the time it's stereo, so that answers the question that we're going to take a poll on in a minute. I want to wait 1 or 2 more slides. This was a DVD authoring room, Mikasa Studios. It was actually Bob Margloff's studio. I love the name because DVDs ended up in the house. So he rented Bela Lugosi's old mansion and called his studios Mikasa Studios, which he made it even look like a living room, but don't kid yourself. This is quite a bit of acoustics in here behind these drapes, above this cloud, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a more formalized Atmos mixing room. Actually, Dolby, I'm sorry, Dolby, not Atmos. Another 5-1 room. And an Atmos mixing room. So this is a good time for our poll number 3. Justin, if you want to flash up, I wouldn't mind waiting just a few minutes on this because I'm very interested to see how everybody reacts to this one. So we'll leave this one up for a little bit. Actually, I can't answer, so I can take this off. So 50 years later, and I have been doing this for 50 years. You could have connected the dots on the dates. That just means I'm old. But still young at heart, still working every day. I love my job. I love working. I'm really blessed to have an extraordinary team of partners. 3 or 4 years ago, our company divested half of our ownership and allowed about a dozen people to come in as owners, a sort of next generation. I'm really fortunate. A lot of them are former students who became interns. So we're still dreaming, still exploring. We still continue to be at the nexus of these 3 words. Nothing's really changed for me. I love these 3. If you could add baseball and cooking and my wife to the list, that would pretty much complete it, but those 3 we're not going to talk about. Okay. And I believe studios will continue to be different. So let's take a look at some different ones. This is a recording studio. I figured I kind of dug around and we didn't do these studios. I wanted to just put up some crazy ones. They're all studios. They all count. I'm not sure if they all sound good. I'm just quickly looking at the poll. And this is kind of what I thought, but a year from now, this will change. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in that. You're really helping us. Thank you. This is a recording studio. It's not the first time somebody's had a car in a mastering studio. We actually did one in New Jersey where part of the mastering studio was a car. This was the craziest one I found. Okay. Well, maybe this one's the craziest one. We'll come back to the Airstream recording studio idea in a minute. This is a not so perfect version, but we'll take a look at a better one. I love this one. I'm not sure what I'm looking at, but I love it. Very cool, very clean. Obviously a guitar player. So they will want to be exciting and they will want to be technically excellent. There's no excuse and there'll be no reason for the studios of tomorrow to not be exciting, to continue to have the same vibe that Jimmy and Eddie wanted, and for every one of them to be technically excellent. It's not going to be that hard, okay? And written in white ink on this same slide, acoustically perfect. Okay, let's look at some of the last few ones that we've done, and then we'll just sort of bring this to a conclusion. This is a studio in the Middle East, so it's got some Middle East architecture in it. I love working in foreign countries and foreign vernaculars because it forces you to, those are those same clouds that we've sort of, membrane absorbers. One of our designers, Sergio Mojo's wife, had the idea to make these membrane absorbers be the lights themselves. Why have lights in the membrane absorbers? We can just make the membrane absorbers be the lights. Okay, this is Dream Asylum in Miami, Nate's and Marcella's studio, two great, Marcella, of course, one of our great lady engineers right now, and Nate Danger. Nate is, so these are both of their rooms, again, sharing a common studio. They're not in the studio that often, and they couldn't be different as personalities. And of course, their rooms look different. They're supposed to be different. They just got different vibes. You can kind of guess which one is Nate's and which one is Marcella's. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay. And why am I putting this studio up? This was one of the first times that I tried to get ear level monitoring and through window looking into a studio, because we wanted 5.1 monitoring and looking into a studio very, very early on. Well, the idea didn't quite work out. Well, we didn't install the middle speaker yet in this picture. The wall between the studio, the monitors and the glass got too thick, and I put them at different levels. That was a mistake. And then the builders put frames around the windows, which I hated. And so it ended up sort of looking like speakers with holes in the wall. But I never forgot or left the idea of someday having a glass wall And remember, maybe the glass could be the speakers, or we could put the glass in the speakers. And of course, we finally got a chance to do it. I always thought it was ironic that the first moment that we did get a chance to do that was for a religious recording company. We had to lie and tell them that we knew how to do it, which of course we didn't really know how to do it. I always thought that was cute, but we did get an opportunity to do it. And we've done it about 10 times now. Extraordinary mixing field here, maybe 8 feet across the console. It turned, the trick here is that this wall, I'll give away one secret, is not an isolating wall. It is not, you could take that away and the speakers away and you'd still have a 2-wall masonry isolating system. That's the trick. But now the speakers are baffled. So SBIR, speaker boundary interference, disappears as an issue. Always better to have a baffled in-wall speaker system. And of course, ear level. A few other tricks going on in the room, which we just won't discuss, but it's really, really kind of cool. And we've done that a number of times. This is another return visit to Paul Epworth's church studio. That was that writing room we took a look at. And this is his SSL room. He had worked at Jungle and wanted an Augsburger system in New York. And we, of course, gave it to him. And in talking to Paul, he said, I said, what do you want this to look like? What's the vibe? He says, you know, I'm thinking that, in an English accent, no less, that it should all be white and then we'll just change everything with colors. And I kind of said, I haven't gone very far in 45 years, have I? Because that's exactly what Jimmy said. And of course, that's exactly what we did. Now a lot easier. You can literally paint the room with a wheel, kind of a little phone app. Very cool. And there's that room again, also with the ability to change colors. But even here, just a little bit of a throwback, it's in a church. So why not make the window look a little bit Gothic? We could not leave this kind of talk without thanking and recognizing Annie Mincielli, one of the great engineers, Alicia's engineer, producer, engineer, and Jungle Studios up on the top 2 floors overlooking the High Line in New York. And lots of design skills and tricks that we developed finally crystallized in making this studio. Glass is our friend. So this glass diffuser in the back looks out all the way down to the World Trade Center. Okay, and speaker is actually in the glass, believe it or not. So you see a panoramic view out this window overlooking the High Line in New York. Okay, even this vocal booth is floor to ceiling glass. What's holding up this wall? Well, no, that actually it's a cable that goes like that, if you must know. And then of course, changing colors, very, very little fabric in this room. This is all perforated wood, okay? Membrane absorbers on the ceiling. This is really holding air conditioning, and the iconic Empire State Building at the end. Glass is your friend, doesn't have to be your enemy. And color is your friend, and vibe is your friend. I throw this slide up as we get to the end here, not because it's a studio, but because this just looks like an amazing concert hall. You could just imagine 4 violins up here, really sounding beautiful. But this is not a music hall. This is a speech, there's the clue, auditorium for a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. Okay, and this room is dead, very, very low reverberation time. How's that possible? All perforated wood on the side walls and microperfed glass and porous openings and absorption on top of the glass. So when Frank Gehry, famous California architect, says, I want to have wood on the side walls and wrinkly glass on the ceiling, you guys figure out how to do it. We now know how to do it. So we are no longer limited by materialization or our notions of materialization. Almost anything is possible now. It's an extraordinary time to be designing. As was witnessed in the Jazz at Lincoln Center project, I'm not sure if I would have started out with this giant glass wall behind the stage for Wynton Marsalis. Okay, but when you look over $1 billion view on Columbus Circle in Central Park, okay, and Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill says that's what we're going to give you, and Raphael Vignoli, the architect of this space, says that's what I want, okay, then that's what we do. So how did we do it? Slope the wall in the inner glass backwards, let the acoustic energy hit this, go up through this curved ceiling, which is really tubes. It's open, it's slotted, and on top of it, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of black diffusers that you don't see, and the sound comes sprinkling down. So the reverb time is scattered and it stays bright excellent for acoustic music. And on the side walls, which are parallel, it's fabric over a checkerboard pattern of diffusers and absorbers. Again, not limited by the architect's preconception of the room. That's the studio that talks to this room. Studios are going to have some strange forms. Is this a living room, home office, recording studio? This could be where Eddie's been working, except this is overlooking the seacoast on Southern California. But there's going to be thousands of rooms like this, maybe not quite as elegant as this one. And the line in the sand between home office, living room, recording room is all being smudged. I think it's a very exciting time. BSO, which of course, Boston Symphony Hall, which of course we didn't design, one of the, maybe the best classical music hall, has its own recording studio. We were really honored to get the tap on that. And every concert is now recorded here. And again, use of wood, low frequency control, and targeted absorption where we need it for first order reflections. Again, even the Boston Symphony Orchestra can have a little vibe. Okay. Studio in China. When we were not able to put a big piece of glass that looked over here, we weren't able to put it here, we just put a decorative piece of glass, okay, with a thermometer. Actually, it's permanently on 55 because that's the name of the studio, 55 Tech. So it's always 55 degrees in the studio, okay? But acoustically, these are symmetrical. Even our first log cabin studio, okay, in rural Minnesota, in the basement of this building, there it is, okay? I called it a log cabin studio because the owner wanted it to look like a log cabin. I would have liked the logs to go up and down so that the diffusion would have been horizontal, but we did the best we could. And notice this producer desk that's on rollers. So it slides forward when he's in the mixing position and then back when he's in the recording position because he does everything in the room. Okay, I'm not going to say who this is studio for. It's a sort of a private studio, but it's for well-known artists that basically records everything in the room, which is again another common trend. And this is my favorite Airstream studio and one of my favorite studios. We found this old Airstream, tricked it up, got it through the window of a brand new building that was being built on the Lower East Side. It's for a girls' school, Lower East Side Girls' School, famous philanthropic organization in New York for over 50 years, okay, where they teach 12-year-old girls how to be radio broadcasters. So it had to get in the building before they were finished. Of course, we took the wheels off it, and that's what it looks inside. So here we have the inside looking exactly like an Airstream on the outside with metal, but of course it's all absorptive. This is all microperf, three different kinds of perforation schemes in order to get the balanced acoustics. So this is a very, very cool interview room and mixing room, one of my favorites. And on the opposite end of the extreme is VSL's Oro immersive recording room in Vienna. A lot of you probably have or use VSL products. This is the room they record in. This is their control room that overlooks that room over here. So just to give you an idea of how big it is. This is an Oro immersive recording room. But as we come to a conclusion, I'm starting to think that maybe some of the rooms of the future are going to start looking a little bit more like this. They're going to be sort of playgrounds or shops. Equipment is going to be rollable, movable. I'm not sure. We're getting some very strange requests. First from schools, which you'd expect, but now from producers. Every month I see another studio introducing an immersive environment of some sort as the standards become a little bit more organized, and also as the acceptance becomes more organized. So maybe our control room of the future is going to look like this, or maybe it's going to look like this. I'm not sure if I like this, but I certainly like the uniqueness of it. Or maybe it's going to look like this, maybe even like this. I'm not sure. I don't know. But as I've come now to the conclusion of my first 50 years, and as my teammates and my partners and my dear friends remind me that we're now in my second 50 years, I'm obviously not going to see the end of those 50 years, but I sure hope I get to see some of this stuff happen. And I sure hope that everybody who's been with us today gets to see some of this happen. The future is, as they said, it's so hot I had to wear shades. So bright I had to wear shades. Anyway, I'm going to steal this photograph one more time from Eddie, and I'm certainly not going to pay him a royalty for it because he's not even on the broadcast. So Jimmy left us extraordinary music, but he jump-started my career. He jump-started my life, and his legacy has influenced the life of a lot of people in our organization, and hopefully other designers and other students of this serendipitous nexus of architecture, acoustics, and technology. With that, I'm going to basically stop. I'm going to hand it back to Justin to do some end of webinar housekeeping. Thank you everybody for staying. Actually, most of you did stay, and please stay in touch. My email is easy to get. Justin, you're going to kind of wind this thing down, I hope, okay? Or maybe there's a few questions that you want to throw out right now.
Yeah, John. Hey, this has been great. I don't know if you want to stop your screen share there so we can see you a little better.
I think I am going to stop that screen share. Thank you.
There's a ton of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. A couple themes. A lot of people were interested in knowing when you talked about some of the software, the oralization software, as well as the prediction software, the cell phone apps, what are the actual tools that you guys are using?
We use CAD Acoustics as an oralization tool. Odeon is another one. The Ezra group has one. These are the sort of three leaders. We've tried them all. We're a little more comfortable with CAT. I think it's just because we're more familiar with it. They all get you kind of to the same place, and they all have their limitations. The low frequency analysis software, we've been using ABEC. Not that friendly, also has its limits. That is software that we are developing our own software. It is called NIRO. I can tell everybody that. Non-iterative room optimization is what the acronym stands for. It is not for public release, but we're going to be discussing it next month in our webinar. We're not sure yet what we're going to do with it. Right now, we're using it. We've done about 20 studios with it with extraordinary results. Isolation software, we use Insel, we use WinFlag, we use Norflag, we use a few others. We use some proprietary Sabine calculator spreadsheets. We draw in Revit, which is a kind of advanced architectural software. We also draw in SketchUp. I think that does it. And if anyone on here gets to master all of them, please send an email for a job. Okay. So you asked the question, so I gave you the answer.
That's great. Just one more, and then a lot of these technical ones we'll take offline. David McKenna, he said that you mentioned taking a 3-month acoustics training at Columbia. He wants to know, is there a great primer book I could recommend to my students?
There's not one great one. You know, that acoustical handbook, the acoustic handbook, that big giant one, there's a few authors on it. It's not a bad book. It's got a lot of stuff in it. There's no one single book talking to the subject that we just had a conversation about. There's a lot of attempts, I think. There's some that get close. I've had a dozen publishers ask me to do one, and I keep saying no, mainly because I'm still working, I'm still designing, I'm still drawing. I like designing. I mean, 2 hours before this, I was sketching with one of my partners and co-designers, Josh Morris, on a studio in Nashville. That's what I was doing this morning because I enjoyed doing it. That acoustical handbook is pretty good. And if that person sends me an email offline, I'll give you 3 or 4 others in the order of how you want to dive into them, kind of depending on where you want to take your students.
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we'll have to follow up on all of these questions.
We will, right? We will.
And we will. And this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone, we have 2 more webinars coming up on July 14th. It's From Dreams to Reality, which is about designing a personal recording studio. That's hosted by Sergio Molo and Joshua Morris. And then on July 30th, we have Adventures at the Low End. John referenced that in his talk, which is low frequency behavior in studio listening rooms. as well as behavior, research tools and advancements. And that is hosted by John with participation from Dirk Noy, Peter D'Antonio, and Renato Cipriano. So please.
Well, if this low frequency subject is interesting to you, you definitely, you want to go to all of them. We tried to make them spaced a little bit apart, and they're all amazing, but there will be some things we discussed that have not been discussed before in that third webinar.
Great, and these are all available on our website, wsdg.com, and under the education section, you will see webinars. Also, check out our social media. Follow us there. We will be promoting all those webinars on social media. Sign up for our newsletter, and please come back. This has been amazing. I want to say
one last little final, if I can.
Oh, absolutely, John.
I should have said it in the beginning. When we saw the response for this, which was extraordinary in my humble opinion, we actually one of my partners said, boy, we should have had like a financing part of this, like a donate tip jar. We don't want any money, and it would go towards some sort of musician's benefit. The idea came a little too late, and it's kind of complicated, and we're not really in the business of creating tip jars and donates. But if any of this was interesting to you, okay, remember, no music, none of this makes sense. Everything we talked about doesn't really make any sense unless there's music. I don't have to remind everybody that the musicians right now have not had an easy time in the last few months. So if this was interesting and you want to throw 25 bucks to your local club or whatever organization in your universe helps musicians on our behalf or on your behalf, please do so. A world without music simply doesn't make any sense. With that, I think I'm going to sign off. Justin, you'll get the last sign off because that's your job.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Great. Thanks.